It was a quiet morning in the small town of Riverwood, where the sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft glow across the empty streets. Officer Jacobs, a calm and steady presence on the local police force, had already begun his patrol for the day. His car hummed smoothly as he drove through the neighborhoods, keeping an eye on things, looking out for anything unusual. It was a typical start to a day on the job. Officer Jacobs had been on the force for over 10 years, and traffic stops had become second nature to him. Most days, he pulled over speeding cars or issued warnings for minor infractions. Nothing ever seemed to surprise him anymore. He had seen it all. Drivers rushing to work, families hurrying to appointments, and the occasional distracted driver. Today, he hoped for a quiet shift. But little did he know, his day was about to take an unexpected turn. As he rounded a corner, he noticed a silver sedan speeding down the street. The car zipped past him in a blur, its tires skimming the asphalt. Officer Jacobs immediately flicked on his siren and turned his patrol car behind the speeding vehicle. He didn't have to chase it. His lights were enough to get the driver's attention. The sedan slowed and pulled over to the side of the road, just as Jacobs had expected. He parked his car behind the silver sedan, grabbed his ticket book, and walked up to the driver's side. With one hand resting on his belt, he tapped lightly on the window. The driver, a woman in her early 30s, rolled it down with a calm but slightly worried look on her face. Officer Jacobs greeted her with a polite smile. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you know why I stopped you today?" The woman, dressed in light blue scrubs, looked up at him and nodded, clearly a little nervous. "I'm sorry, officer. I was running a bit late. I didn't realize I was speeding," she replied, her voice soft but sincere. Officer Jacobs glanced at her with a knowing smile. He had dealt with plenty of drivers who said the same thing. "You're a nurse, aren't you?" he asked, glancing at her uniform. The woman's eyes brightened with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Yes, I am. Just finished a long shift at the hospital," she said, rubbing her eyes slightly. "I was on my way home to grab a few hours of sleep before my next shift." Officer Jacobs nodded in understanding. He had a deep respect for healthcare workers, knowing how exhausting their jobs could be. "I understand, but you still need to keep an eye on your speed, especially in these neighborhoods. Kids and pedestrians are everywhere. Can I see your license and registration, please?" As the woman reached for her purse to retrieve the documents, Officer Jacobs took a step back, giving her some space. It was just another routine stop, nothing out of the ordinary, or so he thought. But as the woman handed over her documents, Officer Jacobs couldn't help but notice something strange. He could see a young boy sitting quietly in the passenger seat. He looked no older than 10 or 11. The boy was staring out the window, looking deep in thought, his face turned slightly away from Officer Jacobs. At first, the officer thought nothing of it. But then, something about the boy's face looked strangely familiar. His heart skipped a beat as he stared at the child. The boy's messy hair and the shape of his face made the officer do a double take. There was something about the child that struck him deeply, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Officer Jacobs tried to push aside the strange feeling creeping up on him. It was just a kid in the car, after all. But his curiosity couldn't be shaken, and he found himself glancing back at the boy every few seconds. Little did he know, this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but ordinary. Officer Jacobs stood quietly beside the car, trying to calm the strange feeling in his chest. He couldn't help but glance at the young boy in the passenger seat again. His heart still raced, but he knew he had a job to do. The woman in the driver's seat, the nurse, was waiting for him to check her documents. "Thanks," he said, taking the license and registration from her hands. He quickly glanced at them before returning his attention to the young boy. "Everything seems in order," he said, offering a polite smile to the nurse. "But I have to ask, is your son okay?" He couldn't help but feel a little concerned. The boy hadn't said a word since the stop began, and his silence seemed odd. The woman followed Officer Jacobs' gaze to the passenger seat and smiled softly. "Oh, that's not my son. His name's Jason, but he's not mine," she explained. "I'm just helping him out for a little while." The officer raised an eyebrow, surprised by her response. "Helping him out?" he asked, still confused. There was no obvious connection between the boy and the nurse. The child didn't look like he was related to her in any way, and they certainly didn't seem like a typical parent-child duo. "Yes," the nurse continued, nodding. "I'm Lisa, by the way," she said, giving him a small, friendly smile. "Jason's mother is a nurse too, but she's had an emergency at work and asked if I could take Jason to his soccer practice. She works late shifts at the hospital, and it's been hard for her to get him to all of his activities, so I've been stepping in." Officer Jacobs couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. He had briefly feared the worst when he saw the boy in the car, but now everything made sense. Lisa wasn't related to Jason at all. She was just trying to help out a fellow nurse. Still, the situation was unusual, and the officer couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this than just a routine stop. "I see," Officer Jacobs replied, giving her a nod. "That was very kind of you to offer your help. It's not every day someone does something like that." Lisa smiled again, but her exhaustion was obvious. "I know it might seem strange, but we're all in this together, aren't we? It's been a rough few months for her, and I thought, why not pitch in?" She glanced at Jason, who was still sitting quietly in the passenger seat, lost in his thoughts. "I'm sure she really appreciates it," the officer said, trying to keep the conversation light. He didn't want to keep Lisa for too long, knowing she probably had a busy day ahead of her. "But please, just remember to keep an eye on your speed. I understand you're in a rush, but there are a lot of people who walk through these neighborhoods." Lisa nodded, her expression softening as she took a deep breath. "I'll definitely be more careful. I've been running on empty lately. It's hard, you know." Officer Jacobs looked at her sympathetically. He could see the tiredness in her eyes, the stress of long shifts, and the responsibility of helping out. He knew what it was like to be overwhelmed by life, though his struggles were different. "I understand. We all get busy, but safety comes first, always." Lisa smiled gratefully at him. "Thanks for being understanding, officer. I really appreciate it." The officer gave her one last smile and a nod. "No problem. Just stay safe. Take care of yourself and him," he added, pointing toward Jason. Lisa started the engine, and with one final glance, Officer Jacobs stepped back to his patrol car. He watched as the silver sedan drove off into the morning light. The conversation had been brief, but something about it lingered in his mind. Jason's face still seemed familiar, and the officer couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed before. With a sigh, he pulled away from the curb, ready to continue his patrol, but the strange encounter would stay with him for the rest of the day. Something told him he hadn't seen the last of that boy. Officer Jacobs continued his patrol, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the silver sedan he had just stopped. The quiet boy sitting in the passenger seat had struck a chord with him. It wasn't just his familiar face. It was the way the boy seemed so lost in thought, so quiet and distant. Something about Jason just didn't sit right with the officer. As he drove down the empty streets, he couldn't help but replay the brief moment when he had seen the boy. The more he thought about it, the more it bugged him. The resemblance was undeniable. The messy hair, the eyes. There was no doubt in his mind. That boy was too familiar. But how? Officer Jacobs had always prided himself on his memory, and yet the connection just wasn't clear. He found himself wondering if he had seen Jason around town before, maybe at a local event or a school function. But there was no way to know for sure without asking. The officer didn't want to seem like he was overthinking things. After all, he was just a police officer doing his job, and the situation was explained away quickly enough. Lisa was just helping out, and Jason's mother had an emergency. Everything seemed to make sense on the surface. Still, there was something about it that made him uneasy. Later that afternoon, Officer Jacobs was sitting in his squad car, parked near the local park, when a voice came over the radio, interrupting his thoughts. It was his dispatcher, calling to inform him of another routine assignment. Officer Jacobs snapped back to attention, pushing aside the questions that had been lingering in his mind. He pulled out from his parking spot, the cool breeze rushing past as he shifted into drive. Yet even as he went about his day, the image of the young boy stayed with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen Jason before, and it gnawed at him. How could he be so sure? Why did the boy's face feel like a memory, like a shadow from the past? That evening, as Officer Jacobs wrapped up his shift and drove home, he found himself stuck in traffic near the town's community center. He sighed, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. Another long day. He was just about to turn his attention back to the road when he saw a familiar face through the car's rearview mirror. There, in the back seat of a passing car, was Jason. This time, though, the boy wasn't alone. He was with another child, a girl, laughing and playing with what looked like a toy. Officer Jacobs' heart raced. He had been so sure of the boy's face earlier that he couldn't help but stare. He quickly checked his mirrors, making sure he wasn't mistaken. But when the car passed, it vanished into the night, and Officer Jacobs was left with more questions than answers. Was that really Jason? And why had the boy seemed so familiar to him? The officer parked his car in the driveway of his home, still thinking about the unexpected encounter. It wasn't just the boy's face. It was the feeling, the connection. Something about Jason was drawing him in. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he had a feeling he would be seeing more of him in the future, whether he liked it or not. The day had started like any other, but now, Officer Jacobs couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead, and why, after all these years, this child felt so important to him. The next morning, Officer Jacobs woke up to a feeling he couldn't shake. The events of the day before replayed in his mind, over and over again. Jason's face, so familiar, yet still a mystery. He couldn't forget the way the boy had looked out the window during their brief exchange. The quietness in the car. The feeling that something was deeply important, yet elusive. As he made his coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his ex-wife, Susan. She rarely contacted him unless it was about their son. And even then, their conversations were usually brief and focused on Jason's schedule or needs. But today, the message was different. It read, "I need you to pick up Jason from the park. He's waiting there right now." At first, Officer Jacobs didn't think much of it. He had just finished his coffee, and it wasn't unusual for Susan to ask him to pick up their son from time to time. But then it hit him like a wave. Jason, in the park. He had seen that face before, and now the pieces were beginning to fit together. He immediately grabbed his keys and headed out the door. The drive to the park was quick, but his heart raced the entire way. As he pulled into the parking lot, he spotted Jason standing near a bench, looking out over the playground. He was alone. Officer Jacobs could see the same boy he had seen yesterday in the backseat of Lisa's car. Jason. But now, the situation felt much more serious. His mind was whirling, trying to make sense of everything. As he approached his son, Jason turned to face him. His expression was blank, almost unreadable, but Officer Jacobs could see the slight tension in his posture. It was like the boy was waiting for something to happen, and that something seemed to involve him. "Hey, Jason," the officer said gently, trying to keep his voice calm. "What are you doing here? Your mom asked me to come get you." Jason didn't immediately respond. He just stood there, his eyes focused on something in the distance. Officer Jacobs stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hey, buddy. Everything okay?" Finally, Jason looked up at his father, and his face softened. "I'm okay, Dad," he said quietly, though there was something behind his words that the officer couldn't quite place. It was as if Jason was trying to protect him from something, trying to shield him from the truth. "Why didn't you tell me you were here yesterday?" Officer Jacobs asked, his voice filled with concern. I saw you in a car with that nurse, Lisa. Why were you with her? Jason shifted his weight nervously, looking away. There was a brief pause, a silence between father and son that felt heavier than it should. Officer Jacobs could feel his chest tighten as he waited for an answer. I didn't know how to explain, Jason finally mumbled. She's helping me, Dad. She's just helping. Helping? Officer Jacobs asked, his mind racing. Helping with what? Why didn't you tell me about her before? Jason's gaze shifted to the ground, his hands fidgeting nervously in front of him. He looked like he wanted to say more, but couldn't. Officer Jacobs could sense there was more to the story, but Jason wasn't ready to tell him yet. The officer's heart sank as he looked at his son. Whatever was going on, whatever Jason wasn't saying, it was clear that there was something bigger happening, something his son wasn't prepared to share. With a heavy sigh, Officer Jacobs placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Come on, Jason. Let's get home. We'll talk about this later. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. Jason nodded slowly, a small but meaningful gesture. As father and son walked back to the car, Officer Jacobs felt a mix of confusion and worry. He didn't know what Jason was hiding, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. The answers he sought were still out there, waiting to be uncovered, and he was determined to find them. The drive home was quiet. Officer Jacobs glanced over at Jason, his son's eyes fixed on the window, lost in thought. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Officer Jacobs could tell that Jason wasn't ready to talk, but he also knew something was wrong. Something was off. As they reached their house, Officer Jacobs turned off the engine but didn't move immediately. He sat in the car for a few moments, trying to gather his thoughts. Jason seemed to sense his father's unease, but he said nothing, his fingers tapping gently on the seat beside him. Finally, Officer Jacobs spoke up. Jason, I know there's something you're not telling me, the officer said gently, his voice calm but firm. And I'm not going to push you. But whatever it is, we need to talk. You can't keep carrying it around by yourself. Jason didn't answer right away. His eyes seemed to look past his father, lost in the distance. For a long moment, he stayed silent, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he sighed and turned to face his father. Dad, I didn't know how to explain. Officer Jacobs turned to look at him, his concern deepening. Explain what, son? Jason took a deep breath, looking down at his hands. Lisa isn't just some nurse I met. She's been helping me for a while now. Ever since Mom. Well, you know, she's been gone a lot. And Lisa offered to help me out. The officer's eyes widened in surprise. Gone a lot. What do you mean? Is everything okay with your mom? Jason nodded slowly. She's been working a lot of extra shifts, Dad. She doesn't have time for me sometimes. I know she's doing it for the money, but it's hard, you know. His voice cracked slightly, but he quickly tried to hide it. Lisa's been really nice. She doesn't mind taking me places when Mom's too busy. Officer Jacobs could feel his heart sink. He had known that his ex-wife had been working long hours, but hearing it from Jason made it more real. He'd always tried to stay involved, but lately he had felt like he was losing touch with his son. Jason's words hurt in a way he wasn't prepared for. The officer had known that parenting was challenging, but this was something he hadn't anticipated. You should have told me about this earlier, Jason, Officer Jacobs said softly, his tone more gentle than before. I didn't know you were struggling with this. I never wanted you to feel like you were on your own. Jason's eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and guilt. I didn't want to bother you. I know you're busy with your work too. And well, Lisa seemed like she understood. I didn't know how to bring it up. The officer felt a pang of regret. He had been so focused on his own life, his own job, that he hadn't seen what his son was going through. It wasn't just about Jason's need for extra help. It was about the loneliness that had started to creep into his son's life. the kind of loneliness that could drive a child to look for support outside the family. "I'm sorry, Jason," Officer Jacobs said, his voice soft but sincere. "I should have paid more attention to you. I should have been there for you." Jason finally looked up at his father, his face softening. "It's not your fault, Dad. You don't always know what's going on with me. I just wanted to get by." The officer nodded, feeling a weight lift from his chest. He knew that this wasn't the end of the conversation. They still had a lot to work through, but at least they were talking now. At least Jason had opened up, even just a little. As father and son walked into the house, Officer Jacobs knew that things would be different from now on. He had a lot to make up for, but he was willing to try. For Jason, for their family, whatever it took, he would be there. The following days were quiet, but Officer Jacobs couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Jason. The weight of what his son had shared weighed heavily on him. He had been so caught up in his own life, his job, that he had failed to see what was happening right under his nose. Jason's loneliness, the struggles he had been facing. It was hard for the officer to accept that he had missed all the signs. Every day after work, Officer Jacobs found himself thinking about his relationship with Jason. He had always tried to be a good father, but somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with his son. The demands of his job, the distance between him and his ex-wife, and the challenges of co-parenting had created a barrier between him and Jason. He couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different if he had paid more attention. One evening, after another long shift, Officer Jacobs sat down at the kitchen table, his mind racing. He was exhausted from the workday, but his thoughts kept him awake. The quiet emptiness of the house seemed to mirror the feelings of isolation he had seen in Jason. His son was growing up, and he didn't want to miss any more important moments. He had to do better. He glanced over at the family photos on the wall, memories of better times. There were pictures of him and Jason at the park, at birthdays and holidays, times when they had laughed and enjoyed each other's company. But now, the pictures felt like a reminder of what was missing, the connection between them that had faded over the years. Maybe I should talk to Susan, Officer Jacobs thought. He hadn't spoken to his ex-wife much since their divorce. They had a cordial relationship, but it was clear that their separate lives had made it harder to co-parent effectively. He needed to discuss things with her, to make sure they were on the same page when it came to Jason's well-being. The next morning, Officer Jacobs called Susan. His heart raced a little as he dialed her number, unsure of how the conversation would go. After a few rings, she picked up. "Hello." Susan's voice sounded tired, but there was warmth in it. It had always been that way, even when their marriage had started to fall apart. "Hey, Susan, it's me," Officer Jacobs began, his voice steady but sincere. "I've been thinking about Jason, about everything." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her tone gentle. "I think I've missed some things. I've been so caught up in work and everything else that I haven't really seen what Jason's going through," he admitted, feeling a bit vulnerable. "I know he's been struggling, and I want to make sure we're both doing everything we can to help him." Susan sighed softly, and for a moment, Officer Jacobs could hear the sound of her moving around in the kitchen. "I know. It's been hard for him. And for me too. He's been through a lot, and we've both been trying to hold it together." They talked for a while, discussing Jason's needs, his challenges, and how they could both do better to be there for him. Officer Jacobs felt a weight lifting off his shoulders as they spoke. It was clear that they both cared deeply for their son and wanted what was best for him. But they needed to be more united in their approach. After hanging up the phone, Officer Jacobs felt a sense of relief. The conversation with Susan had been hard, but it was necessary. They were on the same page now. They both wanted to make sure Jason felt supported, loved, and not alone. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready to try. For Jason, for their family. The officer knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. It wouldn't be simple, and it wouldn't be quick, but he was determined to rebuild his relationship with Jason. He wouldn't let anything come between them again. He had learned the hard way that being a parent required more than just being present. It meant truly being there for your child, no matter the cost. And that was a lesson he wasn't about to forget. The days after his conversation with Susan were filled with a new sense of purpose for Officer Jacobs. He had taken the first step in mending his relationship with Jason, but he knew there was still a lot of work to do. He spent more time with his son, taking him out for small trips to the park, watching movies together, and just talking. It wasn't easy. Jason was still hesitant to open up fully, but the officer could see that the distance between them was starting to close. One Saturday afternoon, Officer Jacobs took Jason to the local park for a simple walk. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was warm but comfortable. As they strolled down the path, Jason kicked at the gravel, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. He was quiet, his face thoughtful, but Officer Jacobs could sense that his son wasn't as withdrawn as he had been in the past. "You know, you don't have to always walk in silence," Officer Jacobs said with a smile, trying to break the tension. "I don't bite, you know." Jason glanced up at his dad, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I know, I'm just thinking." The officer nodded, letting his son have his space. He knew Jason needed time to process everything. Still, it was nice to hear him speak, even if it was just a small sentence. For the first time in a while, Officer Jacobs felt like they were on the right track. As they continued their walk, the officer spotted a small group of kids playing soccer on the nearby field. He turned to Jason, his voice light and casual. "You used to love soccer when you were younger. Do you still play?" Jason hesitated, then shrugged. "Not really. I don't have time." The officer frowned slightly. "You used to be really good at it. Why not pick it up again? I bet you could still be great." Jason was quiet for a moment. But then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I guess I just don't feel like I fit in with the other kids anymore. It's different now." The officer felt a pang of sadness for his son. He knew that Jason had always been an active kid, always eager to join in games with his friends. But now, something had changed. His son seemed unsure of himself, almost like he didn't belong. "Jason," Officer Jacobs began, his voice softer than before, "you've always been good at so many things. You don't need to fit in with anyone else. You just need to be yourself. And if you want to play soccer again, I'll be right here, cheering you on." Jason glanced up at his dad, his eyes filled with something close to hope. "You would?" he asked, sounding surprised. "Of course," the officer replied, smiling warmly. "I'll always support you, no matter what. And if you ever want to talk about anything at all, I'm here. I promise." Jason smiled back, a real smile this time, and it made Officer Jacobs' heart swell with pride. It had been a long road to get here, but the officer felt like they were finally making real progress. The walls that Jason had put up were slowly coming down, and it felt like a breakthrough. The rest of the afternoon was spent in a quiet, peaceful silence as father and son walked through the park. It wasn't filled with long conversations, but there was a comfortable peace between them that hadn't been there before. And in that silence, Officer Jacobs knew that they were healing. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would still be struggles ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were on the right path. As they made their way back to the car, Jason spoke up once more. "Maybe I'll try playing soccer again. I could use some practice." Officer Jacobs smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "That's the spirit, Jason, and I'll be right there, practicing with you." For the first time in a long time, Officer Jacobs felt confident that, together, they could face whatever came next. The weeks passed by, and the connection between Officer Jacobs and Jason continued to grow. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been in a long time. They spent more time together, whether it was playing soccer in the yard, watching movies on quiet nights, or just talking over dinner. Jason had started to open up more, sharing his thoughts and feelings with his father. It felt like they were slowly building a stronger bond, one day at a time. One evening, after a long day at work, Officer Jacobs came home to find Jason sitting at the kitchen table, looking deep in thought. The officer set down his bag and walked over to his son. "Hey, buddy, what's going on?" Officer Jacobs asked, noticing the serious expression on Jason's face. Jason looked up, meeting his father's gaze. "Dad, can we talk for a minute?" His voice was quiet but steady. Officer Jacobs sat down across from him, feeling a small knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure what was coming, but he could tell that this conversation was going to be important. "Of course, Jason. What's on your mind?" The officer replied, his tone calm and encouraging. Jason took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he started, his voice soft. "I've been feeling a little lost, like I don't really know where I fit in anymore." He paused, his eyes dropping to his hands as he fiddled with the edge of his sleeve. "It's not just about soccer or school or anything like that. It's more about everything." Officer Jacobs nodded, his heart aching for his son. He could hear the uncertainty in Jason's voice, and it made him realize how much more he needed to understand about what his son was going through. "I get it, Jason," the officer said quietly. "You've been through a lot, and I know it hasn't been easy for you. I wish I had been there more to help you through it." He reached across the table, placing a hand on Jason's arm, a gentle but firm touch. "I'm sorry for not noticing sooner, for not being there when you needed me." Jason looked up at his dad, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. "It's not your fault, Dad. I know you've been trying. It's just, I felt kind of alone, you know. Like I was just going through the motions, trying to keep up with everything, but not really feeling like I belong anywhere." The officer's heart sank at hearing those words. He had known that Jason was struggling, but hearing it so plainly was a wake-up call. He realized how much his son had been carrying all by himself. "You're not alone, Jason," Officer Jacobs said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "You've got me, and I'll always be here for you, no matter what. I know I haven't been the best at showing it, but I'm going to try harder. You don't have to carry this on your own." Jason blinked back tears, and for the first time in a long while, the officer saw a glimpse of vulnerability in his son. It wasn't easy for Jason to open up like this, but Officer Jacobs was proud of him for speaking his truth. "I know, Dad," Jason said quietly. "I just didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't want to seem weak, you know." "I understand," the officer replied gently. "But asking for help doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong. It takes courage to talk about what's really going on inside, and you don't have to hide it from me. I want to be here for you, through everything." Jason nodded slowly, his face softening. "Thanks, Dad. I think I needed to hear that." Officer Jacobs smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Anytime, Jason. We're a team, okay? You and me. And we'll figure this out together." The father and son sat there for a while longer, the silence between them now a comfortable one. It wasn't full of answers, but it was full of understanding. For the first time in what felt like forever, Officer Jacobs knew that things were starting to fall into place. There was still work to be done, but the bond between him and his son was stronger than ever. As they finished their conversation, the officer knew that this moment would be one they both would remember. It marked a new chapter for their relationship, one where honesty and support would lead the way forward. And no matter what challenges came next, they would face them together. The weeks after their heartfelt conversation passed slowly but steadily. Officer Jacobs had noticed a change in Jason, a positive one. His son was more open, more willing to talk about his feelings, and had started to show interest in things he had once enjoyed. The heavy weight of silence had lifted, and there was a new sense of connection between father and son. Though things weren't perfect, the officer felt a growing sense of hope. They still had their challenges, but they were facing them together as a team. Officer Jacobs knew that it wasn't just about the big talks or the moments when they shared deep feelings. It was the little things, the time spent together, the smiles exchanged, the quiet moments of understanding that mattered most. That was where the real change happened. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch together, Officer Jacobs couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. It had been a long road, full of misunderstandings and missed moments, but things were finally starting to fall into place. "You know, Jason," Officer Jacobs said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "I've been thinking a lot about how much things have changed since we started talking. I'm proud of you." Jason glanced up from the book he had been reading, his eyes softening. "I'm proud of you too, Dad. I think we're doing okay." The officer smiled warmly at his son. "Yeah, we are. But I also know we've got a long way to go. It's not always going to be easy, but as long as we stick together, we'll be fine." Jason nodded, a small grin appearing on his face. "I think we're getting better at this whole family thing." Officer Jacobs chuckled at that. "You're right. It's definitely a work in progress, but I think we're on the right track." They sat in silence for a while longer, enjoying the peaceful afternoon. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was just the two of them, together, in a moment of quiet understanding. And in that moment, Officer Jacobs realized how important these times were. It wasn't about fixing everything all at once. It was about showing up for each other, day after day, and making sure no one ever had to feel alone. That evening, as Jason got ready for bed, Officer Jacobs sat in his son's room for a few minutes. He watched as Jason carefully arranged his things on his desk, organizing his schoolwork and other small items. It was a simple task, but it was a sign of how much Jason was growing. His son was becoming more responsible, more independent, and it filled the officer with a sense of pride. Before leaving the room, Officer Jacobs paused in the doorway. "Good night, Jason. I'm really proud of you. You've come a long way, and I'm lucky to be your dad." Jason looked up at him, his eyes sincere. "Thanks, Dad. I'm proud of you too. You've been there when it mattered." Officer Jacobs smiled, feeling the warmth in his chest. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Their relationship had been tested, but they had come through it stronger than before. And as he left the room, the officer felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. No matter what happened next, he knew they would face it together. The officer sat down in his favorite chair, reflecting on the journey they had taken. It had been filled with difficult moments, but it had also been filled with growth, understanding, and connection. He had learned that being a parent wasn't just about providing for your child. It was about being there for them in every way possible, through the good times and the bad. And as the night settled in, Officer Jacobs realized that, despite everything, he had everything he needed, his son, and the promise of a brighter future together.